The silence in the courtroom was piercing. Judge Helena calmly leafed through the papers in front of her, analyzing yet another complicated adoption case, as she did every day. But at that moment, something different happened. On the other side of the room, a slight 10-year-old boy watched her with wide, attentive eyes. His expression carried something that Helena couldn't immediately decipher until he spoke. "You are my mother." Shock ran through every corner of the room like thunder. The judge's heart wavered for a second. Something rare for someone used to dealing with other people's emotions without showing her own. Everyone looked at each other. Some murmured in surprise, but the boy's gaze remained fixed on hers without hesitation. Helena swallowed. That boy had to be wrong. She never had children, or did she? An unsettling thought, a chill down my spine, a feeling that something much bigger was about to be unearthed. What did that boy know? How could he claim something so impossible? And above all, why did his words awaken a fear in her that didn't make sense? The answer to these questions would take Helena on a deep dive into her own past, uncovering secrets she never imagined she would carry, and what she would discover would change her life forever. The courtroom seemed frozen in time. The audience's murmurs sounded distant, as if Helena had been sucked into another world. She blinked a few times, trying to reorganize her thoughts, but the impact of those words remained firmly in her mind. "What did you say?" Her voice was lower than she intended. Lucas didn't look away. His dark eyes were filled with a certainty that scared her. "You are my mother." Helena felt a shiver run up her spine. That was a mistake. It needed to be. She never had children, never held a baby in your arms. She never experienced anything close to motherhood. But for some inexplicable reason, he felt his stomach turn, as if something buried in the depths of his memory was trying to emerge. The boy's lawyer cleared his throat uncomfortably. "I'm sorry, Your Honor. The boy is confused. Let's continue with the process." But Helena couldn't ignore it. His gaze remained on Lucas, analyzing every detail of his face. Was there anything familiar about him? The shape of the nose, the curve of the chin? No, it was impossible. "Who told you that?" he asked, controlling his tone to sound professional. Lucas just shrugged. "I know. I always knew." The judge took a deep breath and looked away, trying to compose herself. He needed to maintain his composure. She was still a representative of the law, and there, before her, was an adoption case that had to be resolved impartially. But for the first time in years, he felt unable to separate the personal from the professional. At the end of the hearing, Helena hurriedly stood up, determined not to let that shake her judgment. However, as she left the courtroom, her assistant approached her. "Doctor, are you sure you're okay?" You turned pale after what the boy said. She hesitated before answering. I'm fine. I just need time to process." But the truth was that his heart was hammering in his chest. What if there was something true in those words? That night, alone in her apartment, Helena looked through her old documents, her past. She looked at photos from her youth, tried to remember if at any point in her life there was even a possibility of pregnancy. Nothing. But then, like a ghost emerging from the fog, a distant memory invaded his mind. A hospital room, bright lights, the sterile smell of alcohol and disinfectant. She was lying down, weak, her vision blurred. He remembered feeling unbearable pain, then emptiness, and a voice. "Unfortunately, we were unable to save the baby." His body froze. For years, she never questioned that moment. The pain and grief were so intense that his mind simply blocked it all out. But now, something didn't make sense. What if they had lied to her? The next day, Helena decided to do what she had never done before: investigate her own story. He asked for hospital records, talked to old acquaintances, revisited files he never thought he would need to see. And then a terrifying truth began to emerge. The hospital where she was admitted belonged to a private network known for suspected cases of illegal adoption. There were records of babies who were reported dead and later found to have been sold to other families. His stomach dropped. She needed a few moments to calm down before making the most difficult decision of her life. He went to the orphanage where Lucas was temporarily staying. When he saw her, he smiled, as if he already knew she was coming. "You're back," he said simply. Helena took a deep breath, kneeling down at the boy's level. "Lucas, do you know anything about your mother?" He shook his head. "I just know that she didn't abandon me. I always felt that one day she would find me." The words hit Helena like a blow. His heart raced. His hands shook slightly. "I need to do a DNA test," he said, his voice breaking. Lucas smiled. "I know what the result will be." And deep down, Helena knew it too. Lucas' words wouldn't leave Helena's mind. For years, his life had been based on facts, evidence, and logic. There was no room for irrational feelings or daydreams. But that night, as she stared at her own reflection in the bathroom mirror, something inside her seemed to scream for answers. "You are my mother." What did that boy mean? How could he be so sure? Turning to the living room, Helena took out her cell phone and hesitantly searched for the name of the hospital where she had been admitted years ago. His hand shook as he typed. He vaguely remembered that time. It had been a troubled period, full of pain and emptiness. He always accepted the official version, a complication in the pregnancy, the loss of a baby he never got to hold in his arms. The hospital had said there was nothing to be done, that she should move on. But now, that story seemed cold, distant, wrong. The next day, without mentioning anything to anyone, Helena took time off from court and drove to the hospital where everything happened. It was an old building renovated over the years, but it still carried that peculiar smell of alcohol and disinfectant that made your skin crawl. Upon arriving at reception, he forced a professional smile. "Good morning. I'm Judge Helena Vasconcelos, and I would like to access some old medical records." The receptionist, a middle-aged woman, raised her eyebrows. "How long ago?" 10 years. The woman's gaze hardened. "Records this old require a formal request." Helena was already expecting this answer, but her patience was short. "What if I tell you that I am the mother of a child who was born here, and who may have been taken from me without my knowledge?" The receptionist hesitated. Her lips pressed together for a moment, and she looked away before responding. "One moment, I'll call the administrator." Helena felt a chill on the back of her neck as she waited. The woman's behavior only increased his suspicion that something was wrong. A few minutes later, a tall man with a rigid expression appeared. "Judge Helena, my name is Dr. Gustavo. How can I help you?" Helena crossed her arms, staring at him firmly. "I want to see my medical records from when I was hospitalized here 10 years ago." He forced a smile. "As already explained, old records require a formal request. I know. You did something." Helena cut in, her voice coming out harsher than she intended. "If they have nothing to hide, then why the resistance?" The man was silent for a moment and then let out a heavy sigh. "Come with me." He led her down a narrow hallway to a file room. The dim lighting and the smell of old paper made the environment even more suffocating. Dr. Gustavo took out a binder, leafed through a few pages, and finally handed a document to Helena. As his eyes swept over the paper, his body went rigid. There, in the last line of the medical report, it was written, "Fetal death confirmed by the medical team." Helena felt her vision blur. "That's a lie," he whispered. "I understand that this is difficult to accept," said Dr. Gustavo with an almost rehearsed tone. She looked up at him. "Difficult to accept? There is no report confirming the cause of death. No coroner's signature. Just that one sentence." He didn't respond. Helena closed her eyes for a moment, trying to control her anger. All of that was wrong. He left the hospital feeling his heart pounding in his chest. I needed more proof. He spent the next few weeks investigating, pulling documents, talking to retired doctors, until he found a name that appeared repeatedly in the records. Dr. Enrique Almeida, an obstetrician who worked at the hospital at the time of his admission and who, curiously, left the country soon after. Through contacts, he got a phone number. He called, his hands sweaty with nervousness. "Hello?" The voice on the other end of the line was hoarse, tired. "Dr. Enrique Almeida?" A silence. "Who is speaking?" "My name is Helena Vasconcelos. 10 years ago, I was admitted to the hospital where you worked. I was pregnant." The silence on the other side was even longer. "I can't talk about it." Helena felt her stomach sink. "Then there is something to be said, isn't there?" Dr. Enrique sighed. "Listen, Listen, I shouldn't be talking to you, but yes, something happened. You didn't lose your baby." She held the phone tightly. "What did they do to him?" "He was taken, given up for adoption without your consent. The hospital was involved in a newborn trafficking scheme." Helena's breathing hitched. "And where did he go?" "I don't know, but there are records, not in the official files, but in the notes of the former hospital director. If you really want to know the truth, that's where you should look." Helena hung up the phone, feeling the weight of the truth fall on her shoulders. Lucas was right. She had a son, and he was right there in front of her, asking to be recognized. The next day, without wasting time, Helena managed to access the documents of the former hospital director. Among several scribbled sheets and coded records, he found a name. Lucas Andrade. His entire body shook. It was him. It was his son. A sob escaped his throat as he covered his mouth with his hand. 10 years away from him, believing a lie. She wasted no time. That same night, he drove to the orphanage where Lucas was. When he entered the room, he looked up at her and smiled. "You found out, didn't you?" Helena felt tears burning her eyes as she knelt before him. "Yes, my love, I found out." Lucas wrapped his arms around her without hesitation, as if he had been waiting for that hug his entire life. "I knew you would come." Helena closed her eyes and hugged her son to her chest. Now, she would fight with everything to get him back, and no one, absolutely no one, would stop that. Lucas passed many houses, many different beds, many doors that closed behind him. For as long as he could remember, he had never had a real home. At the age of 4, he was left in an orphanage with little information about his origins. The report said he was found in a hospital and placed directly for adoption, but no family stayed with him long enough to call him their child. Lucas's earliest memories were full of unfamiliar faces and voices that always said the same thing: "It's temporary, honey. Soon you will find a home." But he never found it. He went through 4 different foster homes. In the first one, when he was still small, he was welcomed by a couple who seemed kind, but who soon realized that they didn't want a child, but a newborn baby. Lucas was returned as if it were a defective product. In the second, he lived with a family that already had 3 biological children, and who, despite trying to include him, made a point of remembering that he was not really one of them. At the age of 7, he went to his third home, where he stayed for less than a year before the family gave up on the adoption process. At 9 years old, he already understood that some people saw him as a burden, something temporary, an uncomfortable presence. But there was something inside him that never went away, a silent certainty, almost an instinct. He had a mother. I couldn't explain how, but I felt it. On cold nights, when he closed his eyes, he could smell a familiar scent, a soft touch in his hair, a distant voice that he somehow knew was his. One of the social workers, Donanide, was the only person who seemed to believe what he was saying. "I know my mother is alive," Lucas insisted, whenever someone asked him why he never accepted his new parents as his family. Donanide smiled sadly. "You can't be sure of that, my love. I can, yes. I know one day she will find me." The assistant just sighed and stroked his hair without contradicting him. It was in the last foster home that Lucas learned the true meaning of the word abandonment. The couple seemed perfect at first. Big smiles, promises that he would finally have a stable home. For a few months, Lucas tried to allow himself to believe, but as always, everything fell apart. One night, he heard a conversation that was not meant for his ears. "He never seems happy here," said the woman with a tired tone. "Maybe it would be better to return it before the process ends." "I agree, but we have to do this soon, before he gets too attached." Lucas heard it standing outside the door, and his chest tightened. He already knew how that story ended. The next day, their suitcase was packed before the couple even said anything. "Where do I go now?" he asked without showing emotion. "Let's take him back to the social worker. They will find another family for you," the woman replied, avoiding his gaze. Lucas didn't say anything. I no longer expected anything from anyone. Back at the orphanage, Donanide welcomed him with an understanding look. "This time, it won't take long for us to find a family that really wants you." Lucas looked at her. "I don't want another family," she sighed. "Lucas, I just want my mother." Donanide didn't respond, just hugged him tightly. Lucas knew that, as much as they wanted to help him, no one there really understood what he felt. But that didn't matter. He would wait, because deep down, He knew that one day his mother would come back for him. And that day, he could finally say, "I knew it." Helena couldn't sleep. Lucas's words echoed in his mind like an impossible-to-ignore enigma. "You are my mother." Something inside her already knew the truth, but needed concrete proof. The judge, accustomed to dealing with facts, could not simply trust a sensation. I needed evidence. Without telling anyone, he managed to discreetly collect a DNA sample from Lucas, a strand of hair, a piece of cotton he used to clean a bruise on his knee, small fragments that, in a laboratory, could confirm what she already felt deep in her heart. The following days were torture. With each notification on her cell phone, her heart raced, fearing what would be the result. Until one night, when she was alone in her office, the computer screen showed what she feared and wanted most at the same time. 99.9% compatibility. Maternal bond confirmed. Helena put her hand over her mouth, feeling her chest tighten. His entire body was shaking. The tears flowed uncontrollably as she relived every moment of the past few months. Lucas's look, the tone of voice when he called her, the way he seemed to be absolutely sure that they were mother and son. "My God," he whispered. It was real. She didn't lose her baby that night in the hospital. They stole from him the chance to grow by his side. They made her live a decade believing a lie. A dull anger took over her. How could they do this? How could they separate her from her own son, erasing any trace of her existence? But along with the anger also came profound relief. He was alive. Lucas was there, waiting for her. But how to count, how to get closer without scaring him? Helena knew she couldn't just come up and say, "I'm your mother," just like that. He had been waiting for this moment his entire life, and she couldn't go wrong. The next morning, he went to the orphanage. His heart was beating wildly, but his expression was firm. Upon entering, he found Lucas sitting in a corner of the library, leafing through a book. He looked at her and smiled. "I knew you would come back." Helena sat in front of him, trying to contain her emotions. "You always knew, didn't you?" Lucas nodded. "Since the first time I looked at you." She swallowed hard. "I took a DNA test." He looked up at her, attentive, and Helena took a deep breath, held the boy's hands in hers, and whispered, "You are my son, Lucas." His eyes sparkled for a moment, and then a smile spread across his face. "I knew." The boy threw himself into her arms, and Helena hugged him to her chest, feeling a mix of pain and happiness. "We will never be separated again," he promised. Lucas closed his eyes and whispered, "I waited so long for this." Helena no longer had any doubts. He would fight with all his strength to make up for lost time, and never let anything separate them again. The truth had finally been revealed. Helena spent the night awake, sitting at the kitchen table with the DNA test papers spread out in front of her. The result was clear, unquestionable. Lucas was his son, but knowing that and having him back were completely different things. She squeezed her eyes shut, feeling her head throbbing. Her instinct screamed to run to the orphanage and take him home at that very moment, but reason held her back. She was a judge. He knew the laws better than anyone, and the truth was, I couldn't just show up and say, "He's my son. I'm taking him with me." The system didn't work like that. The next morning, he entered the courtroom with firm steps, but inside, he could feel his heart pounding. He sat down in his office and began preparing an official custody order. For all intents and purposes, Lucas was a child available for adoption, and even if biological ties were proven, she would have to follow the same procedures as any other candidate. As he was typing the document, the door opened and his colleague, Prosecutor Marcos, entered without ceremony. "You look different today," he commented, crossing his arms. "Something tells me it's not a common case that's leaving you like this." Helena hesitated. Marcos was one of the few colleagues I truly trusted. "It's about the boy Lucas," he confessed. Marcos frowned. "The orphan? What does he have?" Helena took a deep breath and handed him the DNA test. He read the paper silently, then looked up at her in surprise. "My God, Helena." She nodded. "He's my son, Marcos. The son I thought had died." The prosecutor remained silent for a few seconds, assimilating the information. "And what are you going to do?" Helena held the paper tightly. "What any mother would do. I will fight for him." Marcos rubbed his face thoughtfully. "You know this isn't going to be simple, right? You may be the biological mother, but Lucas has been through foster homes. The system may not make it easy for you." "I know," she replied firmly, "but I won't give up." Marcos sighed. "If you need help, I'm here." Helena smiled slightly. "Thanks." In the following days, She dedicated herself to every detail of the process. He filled out forms, gathered evidence, talked to social workers. I knew that each step would need to be carefully planned. It wasn't enough to just prove that she was Lucas's mother. I needed to prove that I was the best option for him. At the orphanage, Lucas waited. Every time Helena appeared, her eyes shone with hope. "Can I go with you now?" he asked, always anxious. She held his little hands and said tenderly, "Soon, my love, just a little more." The bureaucracy was cruel. The papers took time. The social worker's analysis was rigorous. She went through interviews, had her house inspected, her personal life evaluated. Every detail was scrutinized, and then came the most difficult moment. A hearing has been scheduled. Helena, now on the other side of the court, not as a judge, but as a claimant. He sat in front of the judge who would analyze the case, feeling the irony of the situation weighing on his shoulders. The case's prosecutor began to explain the situation, highlighting that Lucas was a vulnerable child who had already been through many homes and that frequent changes could harm him even more. Even if the applicant is the biological mother, we need to consider the child's well-being above all else. Helena closed her eyes, taking a deep breath before speaking. "Your Excellency, I spent years believing that my son was dead. I lived a lie while he grew up without a family. I'm not here just because I discovered the truth. I'm here because I'm his mother and because he needs me as much as I need him." The judge observed her for a long time before asking, "Mrs. Vasconcelos, do you understand that being a biological mother does not automatically guarantee custody?" She nodded. "I understand, but I also know that no other person will love him like I do." The judge sighed, then looked at Lucas, sitting next to his social worker. "Lucas, what do you want?" The boy didn't hesitate. "I want to go home with my mother." The room fell silent. The judge exchanged glances with the prosecutors and then picked up the papers in front of him. "Considering the biological ties, the applicant's history, and the child's wishes, I grant custody of Lucas Andrade to Helena Vasconcelos." Time seemed to stop. Helena felt tears burning her eyes as Lucas ran into her arms. "I said you would come back to me," he whispered, holding her tightly. "We will never be separated again," she promised. Finally, Lucas was where he always should have been, and Helena would never let him go again. Helena knew it wouldn't be easy, but she didn't imagine she would have to face hidden forces that wanted to impede her search for the truth. The moment he filed the formal custody request, difficulties began to arise in a strange way. Documents that should be processed quickly now take weeks. Meetings were rescheduled without explanation. Reports have mysteriously disappeared. The system seemed to be working against her. In the middle of this fight, she received an unexpected phone call. "Dr. Helena Vasconcelos?" The voice on the other end was firm, but carried an unsettling coldness. "Yes, who speaks? I'm just someone who wants to keep you from getting hurt. It is better to leave this case aside." She was silent for a few seconds. "Are you threatening me? I'm giving you some advice. Some truths should remain buried." The call ended before Helena could respond. His heart sped up. She knew that messing with the truth would upset certain people. But now she was sure that someone wanted to prevent Lucas from knowing his true origin. Deciding not to be intimidated, she sought out Prosecutor Marcos the next day. "Someone called me. They're trying to make me give up." He frowned. "Do you have any idea who could be behind this?" "Not yet. But something very wrong happened to my son when he was born. I want to find out who was involved." Marcos let out a long sigh. "You know this could become dangerous, right? If someone is trying to prevent the truth from coming out, it is because they have a lot to lose. 10 years have already been taken away from me with my son. I won't back down now." With Marcos's help, Helena began reviewing the files from the hospital where Lucas was born. The records were incomplete, confusing, as if someone had tried to erase every trace of that night. But one name caught her attention: Dr. Ernesto Vasquez, the doctor responsible for her birth. She got an old address and went after him. He found an aged man with a tired look and shaking hands. When he opened the door and saw her, he turned pale. "You," he murmured. "I need answers, Dr. Vasquez," Helena said, looking at him. He hesitated, looked around, and then pulled her inside, closing the door quickly. "I knew one day you'd find out," he said, sitting on the couch with his hands shaking. "But I can't talk about it." "Can't or don't want to," Helena pressed. He ran his hands over his face. clearly tormented that night. I received orders. They said their baby didn't survive and that I should sign the documents. But I never saw the body. It wasn't me who declared death. I just followed orders. Helena's heart raced. Who gave these orders? He shook his head. Influential people. People who were interested in erasing this child from their lives. Helena felt her blood run cold. I need names. Vasquez looked at her as if he were having an internal struggle. Then he took a piece of paper and scribbled a name. If you want the truth, start here, but be careful. She took the paper. The written name was Rafael Montero. Helena knew that name. He was one of the directors of the old maternity hospital where Lucas was born, but years later, he became a strong name within the adoption system. Everything started to make sense. Someone took Lucas from her and put him in the system as an orphan. But why? She thanked Dr. Vasquez and left with new determination. Now, more than ever, she needed to fight. Not just to get their son back, but to unearth the truth they tried to hide at any cost. And she wouldn't rest until those responsible paid for what they did. Helena never thought that one day she would be on the other side of the court, not as a judge, but as a mother fighting for her son. Resigning from his position, even temporarily, was a difficult but necessary decision. She could not judge a case in which she herself was an interested party. He knew that, to recover Lucas and reveal the truth, he would need to be free of any ties to the court. Newspapers quickly seized on the story. Judge leaves office to adopt child. Read some headlines. But the truth was much deeper and dirtier than anyone imagined. The system she served for years was contaminated. Influential people, such as Rafael Montero, had taken advantage of loopholes in the law to manipulate adoptions, separating mothers from their children to favor dark interests. On the day of the trial, Helena entered the courtroom with her head held high, but with her heart racing. On the other side sat Rafael Montero, the man responsible for erasing Lucas from his life. He maintained a cold, impenetrable posture, as if none of that could affect him. The judge began the session. The case in question deals with the legality of the adoption process for the minor Lucas Andrade and the possible fraud in hospital records that resulted in the separation of the applicant and the child. Prosecutor Marcos was the first to speak. He stood up and presented all the evidence he had gathered over the past few months. Doctored documents, forged signatures, and testimony that indicated Lucas was never a legitimate orphan. Your Excellency, it is clear that there was an orchestration to remove Lucas Andrade from his biological mother. Helena Vasconcellos was led to believe that her son was dead. And who is at the center of it all? Marcos paused, looking at Rafael Montero, that man. Montero smiled sideways. This is a very serious accusation. Where is the evidence that I had any direct involvement? Marcos was not intimidated. We have bank records that show suspicious transfers to hospital employees. We have witnesses who claim that you were involved in multiple cases of irregular adoption. The judge turned to Montero. Mr. Montero, do you have anything to say? He crossed his arms, still with that arrogant smile. Your Excellency, all of this is nothing more than a desperate attempt by a woman who does not accept reality. The documents may be wrong, but that does not mean there was bad intent. Helena felt her blood boil. She got up. Bad intention? You destroyed my life. You took my son from me, threw him into the system, and condemned him to a childhood without a family. Montero laughed quietly. Mrs. Vasconcellos, how dramatic. You should thank me. His son could have been adopted by a rich family, but unfortunately, there were no takers. The room fell silent. It was then that Lucas, who was sitting next to his social worker, stood up. You lied to my mother. It made her cry for years. Montero rolled his eyes. Child, you don't understand how the world works. Lucas clenched his fists. But I understand what a family is, and you tried to take it away from me. The judge banged the gavel. He arrives. We have enough evidence to open a criminal investigation against Rafael Montero and those involved in this scheme. As for the custody request, considering the biological ties, the child's wishes, and the total illegality of the separation, I grant definitive custody of Lucas Andrade to Helena Vasconcelos. Helena's heart almost stopped. She looked at Lucas, who opened a huge smile. "Can I go home with you?" She swallowed her tears and nodded. "Yes, my love. Now you are where you were always supposed to be." As Montero was led away in handcuffs, Helena hugged Lucas, feeling that justice had finally been done. Not just in court, but in their lives. The fight had been long, but in the end, love won. For OU said, "Let's create this story using only running text, without topics in the construction of my script, using 7,000 characters, adding speeches during the story. Justice is done with enough evidence." Helena regained custody of Lucas. The moment she finally hugged him, like his mother, was the most emotional moment of his life. ChatGPT said, Helena felt her heart quicken when the judge spoke the words she had been waiting for so long to hear. The decision was made. Lucas was his rightful son. After so many years of uncertainty, after so much time fighting the system against lies and manipulations, she could finally call him her son, without fear, without barriers. Lucas looked at her with shining eyes, not believing what had just happened. "So, does that mean I can go home with you now?" His voice was a mixture of hope and insecurity, as if he feared that this was just a dream. Helena felt a lump in her throat, but smiled, bending down to be at his level. "Yes, my love, now you are where you were always supposed to be." Before she could say anything else, Lucas threw himself into her arms. The hug was tight, full of emotion, as if every second lost in the last 10 years was being recovered in that moment. Helena closed her eyes and held back crying. She was no longer the serious and impartial judge. It was just a mother, hugging her son for the first time, as she should have done since the day he was born. The people in the courtroom watched the scene silently. Some were emotional. Others were still processing the impact of the decision. But Rafael Montero, the man responsible for separating mother and son, couldn't hide his frustration. "That's absurd," he muttered, trying to maintain his pose. "This woman is manipulating the law in her favor." Prosecutor Marcos turned to him with an ironic smile. "Manipulating? It seems like the game has changed, doesn't it, Montero?" Two police officers approached. The judge had ordered his preventive detention, and he knew that the fall would be inevitable. "You don't know who you're messing with," he still tried to say, but his voice no longer had the same arrogance. Helena ignored it. He didn't matter anymore. Everything that really mattered was there in her arms. That night, when she entered the house with Lucas for the first time, Helena felt a weight lift off her shoulders. He looked around curiously. "This is your home, son," she said, observing his reaction. He smiled, still shy. "I never had a real house." Those words hit Helena like a blow. How many nights did he spend alone, wondering why he didn't have a family? How many birthdays did he celebrate without knowing that his mother was alive? Without knowing that she loved him, without even knowing him? She walked over and took his hands. "Now you do, and you will never be alone again." Lucas nodded, and for the first time since he'd met him, he seemed truly safe. In the following days, Helena began to rediscover what it was like to be a mother. She prepared breakfast for Lucas, took him to school, helped with his homework. Every little moment was precious. One night, as they were preparing dinner together, Lucas looked at her and asked, "Do you think that if I hadn't said that in court, we would still have met?" Helena smiled, running her hand through his hair. "I think so. Fate always finds a way." But it was his courage that made everything happen faster. He smiled satisfied and continued cutting the vegetables, as if that answer was all he needed to hear. The fight had been arduous, but in the end, justice was served. And more than that, Helena and Lucas finally had what they always deserved, each other. Lucas's first morning in his new home was unlike anything he had ever experienced. The smell of coffee and warm bread filled the air, and the sound of a living house was something he had never experienced before. Helena was already up, preparing breakfast, when she saw him coming down the stairs, still drowsy, with curious eyes exploring every detail around him. "Good morning, sleepyhead," she said with a smile. He rubbed his eyes and sat down at the table. "I dreamed about it," he confessed, "with a house, with a real mother." Helena felt her heart tighten. Now it's not a dream anymore. It's real. Lucas took a piece of bread and began to eat, still absorbing the idea that, for the first time in his life, he belonged somewhere. The first few days were a mix of discovery and adaptation. Helena needed to learn how to be a mother, something that was taken away from her before she even started. Every meal together, every trip to school, every conversation before bed was a piece of the life they were both building. But the past still left its mark. One night, Helena heard a noise coming from Lucas's room. When she entered, she found him sitting on the bed, hugging his knees. "Son, what happened?" He hesitated before responding. "I had a nightmare. I dreamed that you disappeared and that I went back to the shelter." Helena sat next to him and ran her fingers through his hair, feeling the fragility of that moment. "That will never happen. You are here with me now, and no one will separate us again." He looked at her, as if he wanted to believe, but the fear was still there. "Do you promise?" She held his small hands and looked straight into his eyes. "I promise, Lucas, with all my soul." He finally relaxed, laying his head on her shoulder, and minutes later, he fell asleep again. The months passed, and each day at Lucas's side was a new victory. He started to loosen up more at school, made friends, and smiled easily again. But the biggest proof that everything was changing happened one late afternoon, while they were watching a movie on the couch. Without saying anything, Lucas laid his head on Helena's lap and whispered, "I love you, Mom." She felt the tears come uncontrollably. "I love you too, my son." At that moment, he realized that it didn't matter what they had lost in the past. What really mattered was that they were now together. And for the first time, Helena didn't feel like she was just rebuilding something lost, but rather starting a new story, a new beginning. And so we come to the end of this video. If you liked the story, don't forget to like and share with your friends. Subscribe to the channel for more content like this, and turn on notifications so you don't miss any new videos. Until next time,